This little guy right here is a super small flash drive from Samsung that's USB-C and has a decent enough read and write speed to actually work with this Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K and any of the other Blackmagic 6K cameras or Blackmagic cameras in general that let you use USB-C drives to record onto. I'm covering this today because a lot of you have been asking what resolutions does it cover? Can you actually use that thing on the 6K? And you absolutely can. It's just the read and write speeds aren't exactly where an SSD are, so you're going to be limited on specific 6K frame rates, resolutions, whatever at different compressions. So in today's video, I'm going to go over my user experience of using this with the Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K, in addition to go over all the tech specs after doing some testing, what you can reliably film in using this SSD. And believe it or not, it's actually reliable if you're okay with using certain compressions at frame rates. Part of the reason I actually started using this, I bought this for other reasons. I originally got this actually to use with my M1 MacBook Air, as that computer, I had a base model, so it didn't have a lot of storage, and this was kind of helping me. But then I got rid of that computer, got more storage, and these have just been kind of sitting around. I've occasionally used them to actually record with my iPhone 15 Pro ProRes. They work pretty decent for that. I'll cover it in a future video. But then I got the Blackmagic Cinema Camera 6K in. And what happened was I didn't have any cameras at the time that use CF Express Type B cards. So for the first week I had the camera until I bought a CF Express Type B card. I had two of these, so I was just using them to record. And in the highest compressions, they worked in 6K and 6K open gate, especially at 23.98. So it had me thinking with all of your questions, let's do some testing and let's see what resolutions, what compressions we need. What will this work for? I am really just bringing these around as emergency drives because, quite frankly, for professional work, you are limited on the compression unless you want the most compressed B-RAW files on this camera. But if you're using it for YouTube work, this is actually a pretty solid option, especially because you can record directly onto these drives, and then you could just plug it into your computer and then start editing right off of these drives. You just plug it right into your USB-C. You don't need a card reader or anything. And that's where I found these work. But if you need, less compressed, bigger file sizes, these are not going to work for that. I'm going to read some of the technical data off my phone right here, and I'll list them up here in the corner. So when it comes to filming in OpenGate 6K, first I tried 23.98, and I was able to shoot at up to Q3 in the constant quality mode and up to 8:1 in the constant bitrate mode. But then when I jumped up to 30 frames per second, I was only able to shoot in Q5 in the constant quality mode, and then 12:1 in the constant bitrate mode. So that was pretty much it. I couldn't really film anything beyond that, especially because the slow-mo, it doesn't really go much higher than that, so I didn't test that in the OpenGate mode. But then I did test the 6K DCI mode. So for 23.98, I was able to get Q3 constant quality and up to 8:1 constant bit rate. And then in 30 frames per second, it was the same. I was able to get Q3 constant quality, no problem, 8:1 constant bit rate, no problem. And when I say no problem, it means I didn't get any skip frames, they didn't stop recording, but anything above that was less compressed definitely stopped recording at some point. Then when it comes to 48 frames per second in 6K DCI, I was only able to do Q5 due to unreliability. Q5 seemed to be the only compression that I could use, and it actually not stop recording after a few minutes. However, it didn't work at 12:1 in 48 frames per second. So that leads me to believe that although Q5 seemed to work after a few minutes, it's possible that even Q5 on these little things may not work at 48 frames per second. So if you're going to shoot really short clips and you need to use this, it'll work. If you're going to shoot longer clips at 48 frames per second, I would not rely on this, especially if there's a lot of motion in it. You just don't know. Part of the reason I think Q5 works is it's not a consistent bit rate. That's why it's different from the 12:1, which is a consistent bit rate. And in all the Q modes, the constant quality modes, it really just depends on what's in your scene and how much the bit rate's going to end up being. It's a variable bit rate, so it's not a guaranteed overall file size depending on how long the clip is. And that's kind of why I like it. If there's not a lot of motion, it's going to use less data. If there is a lot of motion, there's going to be more data or more colors, whatever it may be, but they're just not consistent. So that was 6K. Then I did try 4K 60. Now 4K 60, I was able to shoot up to 8:1 in the constant bitrate mode, and I was able to shoot up to Q3 in the constant quality mode. And that was 4K 60. The lower you go, the better you're going to get. But for 4K, that's kind of what I'm interested in this camera. So I just tested that mode. And then there's HD, because there's HD 120 frames per second and lower. And it seemed that the HD modes, it worked for all compressions, no matter what, even at 120 frames per second, which is pretty cool. So if you're shooting in HD, not an issue on this. And that was my testing with this card. I tested each one for around 5 minutes, and that's how I could kind of tell if it was going to drop frames or not. A lot of the other bit rates, they would drop frames after around a minute or so if it was kind of hanging on there, and if it wasn't going to hang on, it would drop frames after like 30 seconds or so. Now, let's talk about usability, because yeah, this is a super small SSD, and using this camera as a studio camera kind of makes sense. Sitting on a tripod, if you're going to use it for YouTube like I'm using, you're not really likely to hit it. So for stationary setups where there's not a lot of people around, I could totally see this. But as we all know from these Blackmagic cameras, especially in this pocket design, the USB-C port can be fragile. So I would say if you are going to use this as a gig camera, let's forget the fact that it's not going to work in all of the frame rates, resolutions, compressions, any of that. You have this little piece right here, I'll show you, just kind of sticking out your camera very slightly. So let me put this in here. You also, if you have the flaps on like I do, because I don't think I'm going to take the flaps off this camera, you have to take off the HDMI flap and the USB XLR flap. So let's bring this up to the camera. Right here, you can see it does stick out. It sticks out a little bit, not a lot, and it's pretty compact, but it does stick out. So for run and gun work, I don't know if I would go ahead and use this, just because what happens if you accidentally just, take your hand and you accidentally move real quick and you hit the thing out and you break your USB port? I don't know if it's worth it. I'd probably spend the extra money on a CF Express B card because it's in the camera. You're not going to worry about this kind of stuff. But where I think these things make a lot of sense, again, is for studio work or last resort. Like you have all your cards with you and maybe you don't have a DIT, you can't offload them, and you really need to get some clips. These can be a really great last resort. Now, I mentioned in the video title, you can get these for like 20 bucks. Now, this is the 256 one. This one varies. Like right now, it's like $28, $29 on Amazon, and the 128 gig one is 20 bucks. So it really depends. I think if you're going to use this as a pure last resort, you could probably just go for the 128. But at the same time, these things are so cheap, I would just go for the 256 if you're going to have one for a last resort. It's $8, $9. You're already saving so much money, especially compared to a CF Express 128 or 256 card. They're just considerably cheaper. But again, it really depends on the use case. I know a lot of Blackmagic users like to use the SSDs. I am kind of on and off about them. I rather just use the card internally. That's why when I had the pocket cameras, I just used the CFast 2.0 cards, because although they were really expensive, they were at least inside the camera. I just didn't like having the cord outside the camera and having to plug it in all the time. I've had Blackmagic cameras that had the USB-C break off. I've just had a bad experience. So that's why, for me, I'm really only planning on using this as a last resort or here in the studio. Now, ever since I got my CFB card, even in the studio, I'm pretty much using my CFB card just to make things easier. But it's nice to have this, or if I get another camera where I want to put the CFB card in, I just can. So it's nice to have it as an option. And I mean, look, they are so small. Just leaving it in your bag is like a last case, worst resort media. Not the end of the world. So that's my experience with it. If you have any questions, make sure to let me know in the comments below. I'm going to be having some content coming out on using the battery grip. As you see, I have it, and it makes this camera so big. But in certain situations, the battery grip is really nice to have for this camera. And then I also did get the EVF for this, which I got a really good deal on it, which is why I purchased it, but I didn't know if I was actually going to use it that much. I've been using the EVF a buttload on this camera, so I'll be doing a video on that soon. So if you guys have any questions for those, make sure to put them in the comments below, and I'll try to answer them in those videos. But as always, thank you for watching. My name's Jeff Fagien. I will catch you in the next video. Bye.